On May 4th, 1886, a bomb was thrown at local police during a protest at Haymarket Square in Chicago. In this documentary, we will explore the social and political ramifications of this event and the history of labor unions prior to this moment. This event had many repercussions, particularly in regards to the blooming labor movement, making it a pivotal point in history. In the early to mid-19th century, craft workers generally considered themselves to be small-scale producers, all of whom were equal and free to work for themselves. As the Industrial Revolution came to the United States, however, outwork and factory systems spread, creating more wage earners who were directed by an employer. These new wage earners received minimal wages and lost their previous job security, and thus began to form labor unions for specialized positions such as carpentry, stone cutting, masonry, and cabinet making. In 1825, for example, 600 carpenters in Boston went on strike to protest 12-hour workdays and poor pay, and in 1840, craft workers in St. Louis were granted a 10-hour workday, prompting President Van Buren to set a similar schedule for federal workers. In addition, in 1830, shoemakers banded together to form a mutual benefit society in Lynn, Massachusetts. Then, in 1834, unions in Boston and Philadelphia combined to form the National Trades Union, the first union that represented multiple trades. However, despite the success of these unions, many were less prosperous. At this time, unions were considered illegal combinations, as they were a government unto themselves, and between 1806 and 1847, there were at least 23 cases in which unions were accused of conspiring to raise wages. Many manufacturers also worked to combat labor unions, such as clothing manufacturers in New York, who, in 1836, agreed to fire workers who were part of the Society of Journeymen Tailors. Despite this, many labor unions did continue to form. First, when workers were convicted, judges generally only imposed small fines. Then, a major change in the history of unions came in 1842 thanks to Lumel Shaw in Commonwealth versus Hunt. He upheld workers' right to create unions and to strike to create closed shop agreements, in which employers could only hire union members. After this, union leaders began to expand to wage workers in addition to craft workers, advocating a labor theory of value. This idea held that the price of products should be based on the labor needed to make them, and that the money from the sales of these goods should primarily go to those who made them. Though unions were gaining popularity, in the 1870s, skilled workers still generally enjoyed autonomy, choosing their own hours and using stints, self-employed limits on how much they wished to produce each day. Workers began to lose this as the descaling of labor that Henry Ford dubbed mass production became popular. Things began to be made with standardized parts thanks to new technology, and machines could soon be operated without human oversight. Work conditions thus began to deteriorate as unskilled workers could be paid much less and were easily replaceable. Also, Frederick Taylor's system of scientific management, though parts were rejected, brought forth the idea that workers should not think while working, further deskilling labor. Finally, a depression in the 1870s led to further wage cuts, thus increasing the need for unions. The Knights of Labor began back in the 1870s when a group of shoemakers in Philadelphia joined together to help resist cheaper competition and maintain a price structure. Stemming from the same group of people, the Mechanics' Union was created in the 1820s to unite more than one group of laborers. Finally, in 1869, the Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor was established. This union was initially comprised of 9 tailors, their leader being Uriah S. Steffens. In its early years, the Knights of Labor was a secretive organization, and it governed its meetings from principles found in Freemasonry. A new leader, Terence V. Powderly, was elected in 1879, and within a few years, the group had grown much larger in size, finally abandoning their secretive ways, putting the Union into the public eye. The Knights of Labor were radical in the fact that they wanted to include everyone, with the exception of doctors, bankers, lawyers, liquor producers, and gamblers. Their acceptance of unskilled workers, women, and African Americans was unique at this time. They had 8 main principles that they wanted to live up to, including an 8-hour workday, an end to child labor, equal pay for equal work, the end of the contract labor system, a graduated income tax, establishment of cooperatives to replace the traditional wage system and tame capitalism, government ownership of telegraph facilities and railroads, and finally, a public land policy designed to aid settlers and not speculators. The Haymarket bombing started in May 1886, when 3 unions, including the Knights of Labor, held a strike against McCormick Reaper Works in Chicago, campaigning for 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we will. The leader of the Knights of Labor at this time, Terence Powderly, generally favored boycotts and peaceful negotiations to strikes, so by the time of the bombing, the Knights of Labor had already reached an agreement and returned to work. On May 4th, however, tensions rose as many local anarchists joined the crowd, the majority of them being German immigrants. Police were attempting to disperse the crowd when a bomb was thrown, killing several of them. The police responded with gunfire, killing 4 strikers. The immediate aftermath of this event contributed to immense social upheaval. Due to the involvement of anarchists in the bombing, this event and the following trial sparked a backlash against anarchists, labor unions, and socialists, similar to the Red Scare. The entire immigrant community came under suspicion, particularly those who were German or Bohemian. In addition, Chicago police banned public meetings, and several of those accused were beaten while under investigation. The grand jury indicted 31 suspected labor radicals, and 8 men were convicted in a very controversial trial. The grand jury then imposed death sentences on 7 of the 8 men, and the final man was sentenced to 15 years in prison. On November 11, 1887, 4 of the 7 men, George Angell, Adolf Fischer, Augustus Spies, and Albert Parson, were executed. One of the remaining 4 men committed suicide on the eve of his execution. The trial sparked significant controversy, as many feared that bias against anarchists had played a major role in the court's decision. This sentiment was fueled by statements such as this one from Albert Parson, who was later executed. He wrote, "There is no evidence that any one of the 8 doomed men knew of, or advised, or betted the Haymarket tragedy. But what does it matter? The privileged class demands a victim, and we are offered a sacrifice to appease the hungry yells of an infuriated mob of millionaires who will be contented with nothing less than our lives. Monopoly triumphs. Labor in chains ascends the scaffold for having dared to cry out for liberty and right." After a surge of public outrage, in 1893, Illinois Governor John Peter Aldged was petitioned by criminal attorney Clarence Darrow and others to pardon the remaining men on the basis that both the judge and the jury were biased, and that much of the evidence had been fabricated. Being German himself, he pardoned them, calling them victims of hysteria, packed juries, and a biased judge. Additionally, this day, though immediately afterwards it was spurred discontent with labor unions, would later become a symbol of the heroic age of the labor movement. It represented the struggle of labor unions early on, and even led to the creation of May Day. Another major impact of this event was its political ramifications in the labor movement. Though the Knights of Labor were not part of the bombing, they were generally associated with it. Thus, in the view of the press and many Americans, they were tainted and began to lose popularity and die out. As the Knights lost popularity, however, many turned to the less radical American Federation of Labor, or AFL, led by Samuel Gompers, a Dutch-Jewish cigar maker. Gompers believed that the Knights focused too much on electoral politics, and thanks to his experience in the cigar makers' union, he created pure and simple unionism. This focused mainly on skilled workers, organized by craft and occupation, and short-term goals such as better wages, hours, and working conditions. It was also significantly less welcoming to women and African Americans. Between 1879 and 1904, AFL membership rose from 447,000 to more than 2 million, and in the early 20th century, it became the nation's leading voice for workers. This union was particularly successful because its strategy was well suited to this time when Congress was generally unwilling to work with labor unions. In addition, when the political climate was more welcoming, Gompers lessened his anti-political stance, allowing the AFL to continue to grow in influence. This event, though it was quite short, had lasting effects. First, it fueled what many call the First Red Scare, an anti-anarchist, labor union, and socialist movement, particularly in regards to the following trial. The bias involved in this and the 4 subsequent executions spurred public outrage, similar to that surrounding the Sacco and Vanzetti trial in the late 1920s. In addition, this created an immediate backlash against labor unions, particularly the Knights of Labor, leading to their quick end. However, this later became a symbol of the labor movement, and most importantly, it gave rise to the American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers. Thus, the bombing impacted many aspects of society, making it a vastly significant point in history.
Working men! There will be a great mass meeting tonight at 7 o'clock at the Hay Market on Randolph Street between Des Plaines and Home.
The crowd moved north up Des Plaines. Please move north up Des Plaines. Please continue to move around this way. I need to have a conversation with that man. At this moment, a device flew through the sky. And the police began to shoot